The summer of 1941 brought terror from the skies over the Eastern Front, but not from aircraft. A new weapon had emerged that would change the nature of artillery warfare forever. Soviet soldiers whispered its name with pride, while German troops spoke it with dread: Katyusha. The Germans had another name for it: Stalin's organ, because of the distinctive howling sound its rockets made as they tore through the air, a sound that resembled a demonic church organ playing a symphony of death. But the Katyusha was more than just a psychological weapon. It represented a revolutionary approach to artillery that prioritized rapid, overwhelming firepower over accuracy. This was a weapon born from Soviet military doctrine, from the vast steppes of Russia, and from the desperate need to match German technological superiority with raw, brutal effectiveness. To understand the Katyusha, we must journey back to the 1930s, to the laboratories and proving grounds where Soviet engineers were quietly developing what would become one of World War II's most iconic weapons. The story of the Katyusha begins not with a single inventor, but with a collective effort by Soviet engineers and scientists working under the guidance of the Red Army's Reactive Artillery Scientific Research Institute. The primary minds behind this devastating weapon were Georgy Langemak, Ivan Gvai, Vladimir Artemyev, and Andrei Kostikov. These men worked in an atmosphere of intense pressure and paranoia during the Stalin's purges, knowing that failure could mean not just professional disgrace, but arrest and execution. Georgy Langemak was perhaps the most brilliant of the group. Born in 1898, he had dedicated his life to rocketry and artillery development. By the mid-1930s, he was serving as the chief of the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, where he oversaw the development of various rocket propulsion systems. Langemak understood that traditional artillery, while accurate, had severe limitations. Each gun could fire only a limited number of shells per minute, required extensive logistical support, and was vulnerable to counter-battery fire. His vision was different: create a system that could deliver massive firepower in seconds, then relocate before the enemy could respond. Working alongside Langemak was Ivan Gvai, whose expertise lay in rocket motor design. Gvai had been experimenting with solid-fuel rockets since the late 1920s, and he understood the challenges involved in creating a reliable, mass-producible rocket motor. The Soviet Union didn't have the industrial sophistication of Germany or the United States, so any weapon system had to be simple enough to manufacture in vast quantities using relatively crude methods. This constraint would actually become one of the Katyusha's greatest strengths. The breakthrough came in 1938 and 1939 with the development of the RS-82 and RS-132 rockets. These were originally designed as air-to-ground weapons for Soviet aircraft, but the engineers quickly realized they could be adapted for ground launch. The RS-132, which would become the standard Katyusha rocket, was a masterpiece of simplistic engineering. It measured 1.4 meters in length, weighed 42.5 kilograms, and contained 4.9 kilograms of explosive. The rocket motor used a solid propellant that was stable, easy to manufacture, and powerful enough to propel the weapon to a range of about 8.5 kilometers. But having an effective rocket was only half the solution. The other half was creating a launch platform that could fire multiple rockets rapidly and then relocate quickly. This is where the true genius of the Katyusha system revealed itself. Rather than building elaborate heavy launch mechanisms, the Soviet engineers designed simple rail launchers that could be mounted on ordinary trucks. The first combat version, designated BM-13, mounted 16 launcher rails on a ZIS-6. The entire system could be operated by a crew of 5 to 7 men and could fire its full complement of 16 rockets in just 7 to 10 seconds. Think about that for a moment. Traditional artillery batteries might take several minutes to deliver an equivalent amount of explosives to a target area, and they would give away their position with muzzle flashes and sound. The Katyusha could unleash devastating firepower in seconds and be driving away before the first rockets even landed. This wasn't just a new weapon, it was a new philosophy of artillery warfare. The political situation in the Soviet Union during the late 1930s added a dark chapter to the Katyusha's development. In 1937, during the height of Stalin's Great Purge, Georgy Langemak was arrested on fabricated charges of being part of a Trotskyist anti-Soviet organization. In January 1938, he was executed. He was only 39 years old. The brilliant mind that had done so much to create the Katyusha would never see his weapon in action. It wasn't until 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that Langemak was officially rehabilitated and recognized for his contributions. Despite these tragic setbacks, development continued. The weapon was approved for production in June 1941, just days before Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The timing couldn't have been more critical. The Soviet Union was about to face an existential threat, and the Katyusha would become one of the weapons that helped turn the tide. The Katyusha's combat debut came on July 14, 1941, near the town of Orsha in Belarus. A battery of 7 BM-13 launchers, under the command of Captain Ivan Flerov, was positioned to strike German forces that had captured a critical railroad junction. At 3:15 p.m., the Katyushas opened fire. In approximately 10 seconds, 112 rockets screamed toward the German positions. The results were catastrophic for the Germans and exceeded even the most optimistic Soviet expectations. German soldiers who survived the attack reported scenes of absolute chaos. The rockets didn't arrive one at a time like traditional artillery shells. They came in a horrifying deluge, a cascade of explosions that seemed to erase entire sections of the battlefield in moments. The psychological impact was immense. German troops who had confidently advanced across the Soviet Union suddenly found themselves facing a weapon that seemed to come from the future. The distinctive sound of the Katyusha rockets, that eerie, wailing shriek, became one of the most feared sounds on the Eastern Front. The Germans quickly understood the threat these weapons posed and made capturing or destroying Katyusha launchers a high priority. Captain Flerov, who commanded that first battery, understood this as well. NKVD secret police units were assigned to shadow Katyusha batteries with orders to destroy the launchers if capture seemed imminent, ensuring the technology wouldn't fall into German hands. Despite these precautions, Flerov's battery was eventually surrounded near Orsha in October 1941. Rather than allow his Katyushas to be captured, Flerov ordered his men to blow up the launchers and fight their way out. He died in the attempt, but the secrets of the Katyusha remained safe. Throughout 1941 and 1942, Soviet factories worked frantically to produce Katyusha launchers and rockets. The weapon's simple design made it ideal for mass production. While a traditional artillery piece might require precision machining and skilled labor, the Katyusha could be assembled using relatively basic manufacturing techniques. The launcher rails were simple metal frames, the rockets used solid fuel that was easier to produce than artillery propellant, and the whole system could be mounted on existing truck chassis. Flexibility was key. The weapon needed to be deployable anywhere, from the frozen forests of the north to the open steppes of the south.
The Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 and 1943 showcased the Katyusha at its most effective. Soviet forces used massed Katyusha batteries to support their counterattack, Operation Uranus, which encircled the German Sixth Army. The psychological impact on German troops trapped in the Stalingrad pocket was devastating. They were already exhausted, freezing, and starving. The addition of regular Katyusha barrages, with their terrifying sound and overwhelming destructive power, further eroded German morale. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "The Katyusha fire is the most demoralizing thing I have ever experienced. You hear them coming, that awful screaming, and you know that in seconds the world around you will explode. There is no protection, no defense. You can only pray that the rockets land somewhere else and not on you." As the war progressed, the Soviets developed increasingly sophisticated tactics for employing Katyushas. They discovered that massing multiple batteries to fire simultaneously created an effect that was greater than the sum of its parts. A single battery firing 16 rockets was frightening. 10 batteries firing 160 rockets at once was apocalyptic. Soviet commanders began to coordinate massive Katyusha strikes with infantry and tank offensives, using the rocket fire to suppress German defenses just before Soviet forces attacked. The Germans, for their part, attempted to develop their own rocket artillery systems in response to the Katyusha. The Nebel Warfare series of rocket launchers was Germany's answer, and while these weapons were effective, they never achieved the same scale of deployment as the Katyusha. The Soviet Union's massive industrial capacity, spread across the Urals and beyond the reach of German bombers, allowed them to produce Katyushas and rockets in quantities the Germans couldn't match. By 1943 and 1944, as the Soviet Union went on the offensive, Katyushas were everywhere on the Eastern Front. They participated in every major Soviet offensive, from the Battle of Kursk to Operation Bagration to the final assault on Berlin. Soviet troops sang songs about Katyushas, and the weapon became a symbol of Soviet military might and eventual victory. The Katyusha's role in the war extended beyond its direct military effectiveness. It became a propaganda tool, a symbol of Soviet technological achievement and determination. Soviet war correspondents filmed Katyushas in action, and the footage was shown in newsreels throughout the Allied world. The weapon's distinctive appearance and dramatic method of employment made it perfect for propaganda purposes. Here was visible proof that the Soviet Union could match and exceed German military technology. Let's consider the tactical advantages that made the Katyusha so effective. First, there was the sheer volume of fire. A single Katyusha battery could deliver the explosive equivalent of several traditional artillery batteries in a fraction of the time. Second, there was the rapid deployment and relocation capability. Katyushas could arrive, fire, and leave before enemy forces could respond. Third, there was the psychological effect. The sound and appearance of Katyusha fire was terrifying in a way that conventional artillery wasn't. Fourth, there was the simplicity and reliability. The Katyusha had far fewer mechanical components than traditional artillery, which meant fewer breakdowns and easier maintenance. But the Katyusha also had significant limitations. The rockets were notoriously inaccurate compared to conventional artillery. While a skilled artillery crew could place shells within meters of a target at several kilometers range, Katyusha rockets might land hundreds of meters away from their aim point. This meant the Katyusha was essentially an area weapon. It was used to saturate large areas rather than hit precise targets. This limitation was actually acceptable to Soviet military doctrine, which emphasized mass and overwhelming force over precision. The other major limitation was the vulnerability of the launcher vehicles. Because Katyushas were mounted on ordinary trucks, they had no armor protection. If enemy forces managed to engage a Katyusha battery before it could relocate, the results could be devastating. This led to the development of strict operational procedures. Katyushas would arrive at pre-selected firing positions, launch their rockets as quickly as possible, and immediately withdraw. The entire process from arrival to departure might only take a few minutes. Production numbers tell the story of the Katyusha's importance to the Soviet war effort. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had produced approximately 10,000 Katyusha launchers of various types and millions of rockets. This represented a massive investment of industrial resources, but Soviet commanders considered it worthwhile. The Katyusha had proven itself to be one of the most effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal. The weapon's influence extended far beyond the Eastern Front. The Western Allies were impressed by Soviet rocket artillery and began developing their own systems. The Soviet Union also provided some Katyushas to partisan forces operating behind German lines in Eastern Europe. These partisan units used the launchers for dramatic raids before quickly disappearing back into forests or mountains. After World War II ended, the Katyusha story was far from over. The weapon became the foundation for Soviet rocket artillery development during the Cold War. Improved versions appeared, with better accuracy, longer range, and more powerful rockets. The basic concept, multiple rocket launchers mounted on mobile platforms became standard in Soviet and Russian military doctrine and remain so to this day. Modern Russian rocket artillery systems like the BM-21 Grad, BM-27 Uragan, and BM-30 Smerch are direct descendants of the original Katyusha. These modern systems use sophisticated guidance systems, longer-range rockets, and more capable launcher platforms, but the basic concept remains unchanged. Deliver overwhelming firepower rapidly, then relocate before the enemy can respond. The technological improvements in modern Katyusha descendants are remarkable. While the original BM-13 had a maximum range of about 8.5 kilometers and no guidance system, modern systems like the BM-30 Smerch can fire guided rockets to ranges exceeding 90 kilometers with greatly improved accuracy. Some modern variants can fire rockets with cluster munitions, anti-tank mines, or even thermobaric warheads. The evolution from the simple solid-fuel rockets of 1941 to today's sophisticated guided missiles represents nearly 80 years of continuous development. The Katyusha also influenced artillery development outside the Soviet sphere. Western militaries, seeing the effectiveness of multiple rocket launchers, developed their own systems. The American M270 multiple launch rocket system, the British and American M1400 HIMARS, and numerous other Western rocket artillery systems all owe a conceptual debt to the Katyusha.
From a historical perspective, the Katyusha represents several important trends in 20th century warfare. First, it demonstrated the value of simplicity in weapon design. Complex weapons might be more capable in theory, but simpler weapons that can be produced in vast quantities often prove more effective in practice. Second, it showed the importance of mobility in modern warfare. Static artillery positions were vulnerable to counter-battery fire and air attack, but mobile launchers could strike and relocate rapidly. Third, it proved that psychological impact could be as important as physical destructiveness. The Katyusha's terrifying sound and appearance affected enemy morale as much as its explosive power. The human stories behind the Katyusha are equally compelling. Thousands of Soviet soldiers served in Katyusha batteries throughout the war. These men, and many women, as the Soviet Union employed female soldiers in various roles including artillery, operated under difficult and dangerous conditions. Katyusha crews were prime targets for German forces, and casualties were often high when launchers were caught before they could relocate. One such soldier was Sergeant Yekaterina Mikhailova, who served in a Katyusha battery from 1942 until the end of the war. In her memoirs, published decades later, she described the experience. "We lived in constant tension. Fire the rockets, drive away as fast as possible, hope the Germans didn't spot us. Every mission could be our last. But we knew our Katyushas were making a difference. When we fired, we could see the impact on German positions. We knew we were helping our comrades in the infantry and tanks. That knowledge kept us going through the fear and exhaustion." The Katyusha's contribution to the Soviet victory in World War II cannot be overstated. While it was certainly not the only factor, Soviet victory resulted from numerous elements, including manpower, industrial production, strategic planning, and the sacrifices of millions of soldiers and civilians. The Katyusha represented a force multiplier that gave Soviet forces a significant advantage in firepower. At critical moments in battles from Stalingrad to Berlin, Katyusha fire suppressed enemy positions and enabled Soviet offensives to succeed. Consider the numbers. In a typical major Soviet offensive from 1943 onwards, hundreds of Katyusha launchers might participate, firing tens of thousands of rockets. This represented megatons of explosives delivered in coordinated barrages that overwhelmed German defenses. Traditional artillery could never have achieved the same concentration of firepower in the same time frame. The weapon also had important economic implications. Katyushas and their rockets were relatively inexpensive to produce compared to traditional artillery pieces and shells. The simplicity of the design meant that factories with basic equipment could manufacture components. This allowed the Soviet Union to produce rocket artillery even while prioritizing production of tanks, aircraft, and other weapons. The Katyusha represented an economical way to generate massive firepower. In the final analysis, the Katyusha rocket launcher stands as one of World War II's most important and influential weapons. It emerged from the desperate circumstances of the early Soviet war effort, was produced in massive quantities, and played a crucial role in Soviet offensives from 1941 to 1945. Its influence extended far beyond World War II, shaping rocket artillery development for decades and inspiring similar systems around the world. The men who created the Katyusha, Langemak, Guai, Artemiev, Kostikov, and others, could not have imagined the full impact their work would have. Langemak, executed before the weapon saw combat, never knew that his creation would become one of the iconic weapons of World War II and beyond. Yet their collective achievement endures. The howl of the Katyusha, Stalin's organ, became the sound of Soviet victory and German defeat. It was the sound of a new type of warfare, where mobility, mass, and psychological impact combined to create weapons that changed the nature of battle. From the first combat use near Orsha in July 1941 to the final barrages over Berlin in May 1945, and continuing through decades of Cold War development to modern variants still in service today, the Katyusha has proven to be one of the most enduring and influential weapon systems ever created. It stands as a testament to Soviet engineering, to the effectiveness of simple but innovative design, and to the importance of artillery in modern warfare. The legacy of Stalin's organ continues to echo across battlefields worldwide, more than 80 years after those first terrifying rockets screamed toward German positions on that summer day in 1941.